Welcome to episode 6 of my Kawasaki Z1 engine restoration, and in this episode I'm going to be reassembling the carburetors. The bank of 4 carburetors are all ready to put back together. The bright metal parts have been electroplated back to their original zinc shiny finish. All the parts are cleaned and checked and double checked, so today is the day and I'm going to start putting it all back together. The first thing I'm going to do is assemble the rack that holds the throttle and choke controls. So I gather up all the parts I need and put them on the bench ready for assembly. I'll lubricate the pivots where the throttle shaft's going to go. Then insert the felt washers into the pivots. This helps to retain oil to lubricate the shafts during operation. There's one each side. The pivot shaft should now slide in nicely with smooth operation, and it does. I then put on the plastic spacer that goes underneath the spring to hold the spring in place, followed by the spring itself. This engages onto a little peg to prevent it from rotating, to give you the throttle spring back action that you need. The throttle cable retaining bracket then slides in and is held in place with 2 screws. This can be a bit fiddly because you're working against the tension of the spring. With the bracket in place, I check the throttle return and it works perfect. I'm really pleased with that. So now I can fit the wide open throttle position screw. We'll be adjusting this later on when the slides are fitted. I now fit the bolt that locks the throttle actuator to the main shaft and tighten it with my T-wrench. I now fit the 2 throttle lifting arms, one each side. These are also held in place with a long bolt. The throttle lifting arms have balls on each side, one for each carburetor for connecting up to the main linkage system. I can now fit the throttle stop bracket and adjusting screw. I adjust the throttle position by eye to about 10mm. We'll set the gap properly later on. Well, that's the throttle operating mechanism fully assembled into the main bracket. So now I just go around and double check all the screws are really tight, and then we start putting the choke together. The first thing to do is to select the main rod for the choke assembly. This has a thread on one end and this actually attaches to the lever that operates the choke, and that just goes on nicely. Then there's a plain washer, and I'm going to use some thread locker called Stop Tight to hold it all in place. This seemed to work really well. And it's a nice blue colour as well, which is good. And finally I tighten the nut with my T-wrench. I then put all the little screws into the choke lifting arms. These are special screws with a taper on the end to locate a little dimple on the shaft to hold it in the right position, and they slide on nicely, one at a time. When they're in their correct position, you do the screw up and it holds it all square and true. That's one fitted, just got 3 more to fit. With all the 4 screws tightened, I checked the mechanism and it works just perfect, so I'm really pleased with that. So now we can put the adjusting screw in to give it some tension. This makes it so the choke stays on or off, otherwise it would flap around in the breeze. That's better. It's got a really nice damped feel now. So now I'll put a drop of oil on the pivots and we're all done. So here's the finished assembly, the main throttle and choke operating system with the main bracket for the carburetors. And Charlie Weaver's really excited. He has to make up a quick tipple to celebrate. So now we can get on with doing the main carburetor assembly. The first thing I put in is the needle jet. This slides into the centre of the carburetor and pushes down firmly and raises up inside so you can see it when you're looking through the hole. This is followed by the emulsification tube which screws in. I tighten this up with my 8mm spanner, then I can fit the main jet. With the main jet tightened with a screwdriver, I can now fit the pilot jet. This fits next to the main jet in a threaded hole. It's really important not to over tighten the pilot jets because they can shear off easily. I next fit a fibre washer followed by the petrol cut-off valve. This is tightened with my T-wrench. I'm now going to fit the pilot air screw. This screws in the side of the carburetor body and has a spring beneath. I set the initial setting to 1.5 turns. We can adjust that later when the engine's running. I now fit the jets to the other 3 carburetor bodies. With all the jets fitted and tightened, I can now start assembling the throttle slides. The first thing I do is locate the needle in the centre, dropping it down till it hits its circlip groove. Then the lower part of the linkage system drops into the throttle slide and is held in place with 2 screws. The 2 screws can be quite fiddly to fit at times, but with a magnetic screwdriver it's much easier. If you haven't got a magnetic screwdriver, they're easy to make, and I'll show you how. It's easy to magnetise any steel item. I'll just show you here that it's non-magnetic. These are 2 steel screws and the screwdriver will not pick them up at all. Just get any magnet you can find, stick it to the end of the screwdriver and drag it. But make sure you bring it down and drag it back, bring it down and drag it back. Don't go backwards and forwards as it won't work. And now you can see it's fully magnetic. So you can put the screw on the end of the screwdriver and it stays in place nicely to tighten up in the carburetor slide. To take the magnetism away, you need a demagnetizer which you can purchase easily. You drag the screwdriver back 3 or 4 times, now it's non-magnetic. With the magnetised screwdriver, the screws are easy to fit now, so I do up both the screws. Next thing to do is fit a little tumbler inside. This is like a little spacer with a divot in each end that goes on the ball and transmits the force to the linkage system. I can now engage the internal lever arm on its ball so it seats down nicely. Holding the lever engaged with the throttle slide, I then pick up the top nut and the internal little divot that mustn't get dropped. Then there's a special tab washer that goes on top as well, holding it all in place, and that screws down into the lever arm and locates onto the ball. I use a drop of oil just to lubricate it nicely before I actually assemble it. This can all get quite fiddly, but you just need to persevere and you get there in the end. I tighten the top nut with my T-wrench and then check the feel to make sure it feels nice and smooth, which it does. That's just perfect. So now I can tap over the tab washer with my pliers. It's really important that the tab washers are securely bent over, because this prevents things coming apart whilst you're riding, otherwise it would jam up and cause a big problem, and that wouldn't be ideal. I now assemble the 3 remaining throttle slides. With all the throttle arms assembled, I can now assemble the throttle pivot bar with its spacers and shims and springs and plastic washers. I then fit the felt washer into the carburetor body, pressing it down firmly until it goes into its seat. I've had a lot of comments about my special oiler that I always use. This is my ZX1 Extra Lube micro oiler. It works just perfect. The shaft assembly will now slide in past the felt seal into the carburetor body. But before it engages with the lifting arm inside, there's a little plastic washer stroke spacer that has to be fitted. This can be quite fiddly. It sometimes drops down inside and you have to do it once or twice. But in this time, it worked first time. So I was really pleased with that. So now it slides in. And you press it in against the spring, and then put in the central bolt and do it up tight. I then tighten the central bolt with my T-wrench. I can now check the operation of the throttle slide with the lever, and it works just perfect, so I'm really pleased with that. So now I can bend over the tab washer, securing it all in place so it can't come loose. With the throttle slide lifting freely while I operate the arm, I drop a little bit more oil on just to make sure, and then I repeat this procedure on the other 3 carburettor bodies. The next thing to do is to assemble the 4 throttle adjusting bodies. This comprises some springs and some metal cups that engage with the balls on the carburettor and the bracket that holds the carburettors. It's quite a fiddly operation. It involves pressing them down, holding them down while you snap them together, but you get there in the end. Well, that's the first one on. It wasn't too bad, so now we can put the throttle synchronization screws in. These screw in the top. As the screw is screwed in, you can feel the part of the body lifting up. This is part of the synchronization process to move the linkages relative to each other. I spin the nut down for now. I then drop in the next cup. This has to be engaged with a slot, a recess in the bottom of the housing. A bit of a gentle wiggle with a screwdriver and you see it slip in. It's really important these engage nicely. Before I can connect the carburettor bodies back onto the rack, I need to engage the chokes first. This is a plunger system that screws into a thread. And when it's screwed in, nipped up with a spanner, you can check that it moves up and down freely and spring back, and it does. So that's really good. So now, I offer up a pair of carburettors to the rack system, engaging the chokes into the choke plungers, and engaging the throttle linkages together, snapping them onto their relative cones and cups. It's quite a fiddly, tricky operation. You just have to persevere and you get there in the end. I can now carefully turn the carburettors over and screw in the 4 screws, holding this sub-assembly together. I put 1 screw in each carburettor for now, then check the linkage works, and it does. The throttles go up and down nicely. I can now repeat the procedure for the other 2 carburettors until we've got a rack of 4, all bolted up tight. I can now fit more cups and springs to the linkage system and screw on the top caps. Then tighten with a 14mm spanner. I now fit the 2 linkage stabiliser strips, one each side of the carburettor. These join the 2 pairs of linkages together to stop them from flexing. I fit the 4 retaining nuts and do them up gently. I'll be adjusting these later on with my special tool to synchronise the carburettors. I put a drop of oil onto the slides and the bores, then I can put on the polished aluminium caps. The caps are held in place with just 2 screws. With the 4 caps fitted, the tops of the carburetors are now complete, so we can turn it over and start building up the float chambers. The first thing to fit is the petrol cut-off valves. Followed by the floats. One quick last check they're all okay, and they all look nice and straight and good, so they're ready to go in. I carefully lower them between the 2 pillars on the carburettor and insert the pin. This is a little bit stiff, so after a gentle bit of pushing with my fingers, I decide to use my pliers very carefully to squeeze it home. I'm pleased the pivot pins are a little bit tight in the carburettor bodies, because sometimes they're loose, and this can give erratic fuel flow and fuel level. With the pin pressed in, I check that the floats are free to move and bounce up and down on the spring-loaded cut-off valves, and they do just nicely, so that's good. So now I can check the heights. These need to be 24mm from the base of the carburettor to the bottom of the flow, so I use my vernier caliper to do this, and these are all just perfect. One last check that I always do before I put the float bowls on is to connect up the fuel pipe to the inlet stubs, blow, tip the carbs upside down and listen for the hiss, and the valve should shut off the hiss immediately the carburettor is turned over. With the floats sealing perfectly, I can now fit new gaskets and the float chambers. Then fit and tighten the 16 screws that hold the float chambers in place. There's a little tap on the door and it's Tracy with a cup of tea. Now that is just perfect. I now fit the 4 main jet caps with new O-ring seals. And that's it, the carburetors are all together, ready for synchronisation. I look into the tins, there's not a single component left over, so I'm really pleased about that. I'll be using my special carburettor adjusting tool. It comprises of an external socket and an internal screwdriver that you can hold independently of each other, so you can loosen the lock nut, turn the screw in the centre to set the carburettor, and do the lock nut back up without adjusting the synchronisation. Makes the job so much easier. Before I synchronise the throttle slides, I first need to set the gap on the throttle adjuster tickover screw. This needs to be set for 10mm. To do this, I use my vernier caliper and adjust the screw until the caliper just slips in at 10mm. There we go, that's just perfect, 10mm. With the idle screw set at 10mm, I now set the throttle slides to 4.5mm by inserting a drill in the back until it just slides in nicely, as in this case it's okay, but the next one along is a bit loose, so I use a throttle adjusting screw at the top with my special tool to raise the slide or lower the slide until it just grips it nicely, and basically repeat this on all 4 carburettors until the drill just slides in perfectly. With all 4 throttle slides synchronised, the carburettor is now finished and ready to fit back on the bike. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. The carbs are now fitted back on the engine. It's all ready for its first start, but I've got a few little jobs to do first, so maybe in the next video. Anyway, I'll see you all soon. We recently got this hedgehog sign for the garden. I'm not sure if it's slow down for hedgehogs or just slow hedgehogs. Ours seemed pretty slow.